On the 26th of March 1945, the 36th day of the battle on Iwo Jima, over 300 starved and desperate Japanese soldiers launched a last-ditch banzai charge on the American-held airfield. It has been rumoured that the assault was personally led by the garrison's commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Following a firefight, almost every single Japanese soldier was killed, and Kuribayashi was never seen again. Later that day, the US military commanders on Iwo Jima declared the island officially secure. The 3 US Marine divisions which had fought hard for the blasted volcanic landscape were pulled off the island to rest and refit after their ordeal, giving way to the 147th Infantry Regiment composed of Ohio National Guardsmen. Their mission was to occupy the island and provide security for the airfield, a seemingly simple task considering the end of organised Japanese resistance. However, the army soon found out that the enemy remained a very real threat. Almost 2,500 Japanese soldiers were still hiding in the vast tunnel system which had been dug into the island over the past year. Although most had run out of ammunition, food and water, the defenders proved to be even more resourceful than the Americans could have imagined. Men on both sides would continue to fight and die for months and even years after the declared end of major combat. This is the story of the Japanese holdouts on Iwo Jima. When Kuribayashi and his command seemingly perished on the 26th of March, the communications which linked the defenders together collapsed. With no more radio messages or runners providing orders, the isolated pockets of resistance on Iwo Jima adopted an every-man-for-himself attitude. Some chose to surrender, but these were a minority of cases, while the rest were determined to fight to the bitter end. A 17-year-old seaman, Harunori Okashi, summed up the feelings of most men on the island at the time. We couldn't surrender and were forbidden to retreat. The standing order was to defend our positions with our lives. What else could we do? Many men could not stand the thought of surrender as they believed it would disgrace their nation and their families. The holdouts survived mainly by scavenging American supplies. The remaining Japanese soldiers became experts at moving around the island when night fell, taking advantage of the darkness to steal from supply depots. The men formed scavenging parties, usually 4 or 5 men, who would bring back enough supplies for their outpost to survive. Radio man Tsurugi Akikusa was part of one such team which went on an expedition one night. Akikusa became lost before stumbling on an unguarded cache of crates underneath a tarpaulin. He quietly opened the first crates which contained weapons and ammunition, but Akikusa only cared about food or water. He then opened the other crates which contained cans of food and soda. He had never had soda and gorged himself before returning to the bunker, later saying, "The sweet carbonated beverage was the most delicious thing I have ever tasted in my life." Many Japanese survivors described how holdouts in the isolated caves and bunkers divided themselves into rival tribes, each seeking to hoard the small supply of resources scrounged from across the island. They witnessed unimaginable scenes of cruelty as starved and thirsty Japanese soldiers killed each other to survive. Ensign Satoru Omagari was in a bunker which was critically short on water when a lone straggler approached the entrance and asked to be let inside. Noticing that the soldier's water canteen swished as he walked, the guards allowed him to enter before ambushing and strangling him to death. Omagari witnessed the murder of a fellow countryman, but was himself apathetic at the man's fate. "I was numb, I did nothing to stop it, so I am just as guilty." Omagari described another incident when his bunker ran out of supplies, forcing him to lead a small group of soldiers to a different outpost. Upon reaching the holdouts, they were denied entrance by the commanding officer, but an enraged Omagari ordered his men to draw their weapons. A tense standoff ensued with both sides pointing their rifles at each other, before the officer reluctantly agreed to let the men enter. The new bunker was cramped and supplies quickly ran low, driving many men to take their own lives or murder their fellow soldiers in their sleep to steal food and water. Omagari said after the war, "My experiences changed me fundamentally. I lost faith in humanity. I tried to write about my experiences, but no publishers would work with me. They wanted uplifting tales of courage, not the shameful, disgusting truth. I encountered no glory on Iwo Jima." The members of the 147th Infantry Regiment had the difficult task of pacifying the remaining resistance. Whenever the Ohio National Guardsmen located a cave or bunker with Japanese holdouts, they first encouraged them to surrender. Corporal Edward Mervich later explained the reasoning behind this approach. Our superiors told us that the enemy was more valuable alive because they could write letters home to their families and tell them how good we were treating them. The plan was to convince the Japanese not to resist our invasion of their homeland. Often, captured Japanese POWs would lead the Americans to known hiding spots before entering and attempting to reason with the holdouts. The army also made extensive use of their interpreters, including those with Japanese ancestry. Technical Sergeant Terry Doy was a Japanese-American interpreter who developed an effective system for persuading the defenders to surrender. Doy would approach the cave or bunker and take his shirt off in front of the guards to reveal that he was unarmed, before conversing with them in their native language. He also took on the unenviable task of entering the maze of tunnels with a torch, convincing any men he came across to follow him back to the surface. The true number is not known, but it is estimated that Doy's actions saved several dozen Japanese soldiers. He would later receive the Silver Star. The Americans also used harsher but non-lethal tactics to flush out the stubborn enemy. Often when a cave or bunker was discovered and its inhabitants refused to surrender, a water hose was fed into the entrance to flood the interior before tear gas was thrown in. However, this was only partially effective due to the carefully crafted ventilation system built by Japanese engineers which dispersed the gas. Both Ensign Omagari and Radioman Akikusa found themselves on the receiving end of multiple attempted floodings, followed by gassing, but managed to retreat deeper into the maze of tunnels to relative safety. Tragically, many Japanese outposts which resisted by force gave the Americans no choice but to resort to deadly means. Corporal Mervich later described a scene where Japanese POWs shouted into a cave calling on their comrades to surrender, when a grenade suddenly hurtled out of the cave entrance and struck Mervich in the leg. However, it proved to be a dud, and the holdouts were eventually dealt with by flamethrower at close range. At a different bunker, two POWs offered to talk the holdouts into surrendering and descended below the surface. Muffled gunfire was then heard, and the POWs failed to return. Mervich and other men pulled up a supply carrier loaded with drums of diesel fuel and poured it into the cave entrance. Then we set it on fire with a phosphorus grenade, and that was the end of that. Being burned alive was the greatest fear for most Japanese soldiers. The Americans often used it as a last resort to kill or force the defenders to the surface. Burning out the enemy was a methodical process undertaken by both the army infantrymen as well as engineers known as Seabees. First, the Seabees pumped seawater from the shoreline into the cave entrance before mixing it with petrol. In some smaller caves, the men inside drowned before any further action needed to be taken. If the inhabitants survived, the petrol was set on fire and the resulting conflagration would either burn the holdouts to death or asphyxiate them when the flames consumed all of the oxygen. Very few Japanese soldiers survived these gruesome encounters. Yet, Omagari, like most of the holdouts, held no ill will towards the brutal American tactics, saying, "They offered us many chances to surrender." The Americans suffered casualties trying to neutralize the holdouts, despite facing an enemy which had no coherent command as well as meagre supplies. Men who were not careful or vigilant found that the Japanese could still be a cunning and deadly enemy. An army photographer named Ivan Proul had remained on Iwo Jima for the occupation and had become fond of souvenir hunting. One day, Proul spotted a Japanese officer's sword at the bottom of a near vertical cave entrance. He tied a rope around his waist and abseiled down the hole to retrieve the trophy. After he reached the sword, Proul heard snoring and spotted a Japanese soldier asleep with a rifle only feet away. He quickly scampered out of the cave without waking the soldier, but only days later a civilian engineer attempted to retrieve a Japanese rifle, sitting in exactly the same spot, and never returned. Similar traps across the island drew many Americans to their deaths throughout the months following the official end of the battle. The 147th Infantry Regiment suffered 169 casualties during the occupation, including 15 dead. Each isolated holdout had their breaking point, with some choosing to surrender early after the end of the major combat. The largest mass surrender on the island took place 3 weeks after the island was declared secure, when on the 16th of April, 76 sick and wounded men from the main field hospital decided to give themselves up. For months, a steady stream of sick and wounded Japanese soldiers decided to capitulate or were eventually forced to leave their shelters due to lack of supplies. The National Guardsmen counted 867 enemy combatants captured on Iwo Jima, but they were unfortunately forced to kill an estimated 1,602 who refused to surrender. The Japanese prisoners were shocked by the relatively humane treatment they received at the hands of the Americans, whom they had been told would torture and execute anyone they captured. Private Shuji Ishii remembered the Americans offered cigarettes and candy to the men as they staggered out of the tunnel entrance and thought to himself, "We were lied to about Americans being evil, cruel beasts." Once in captivity, the Japanese prisoners were eventually sent to POW camps in the United States, where they received clean clothes, shelter, and consistent meals. They experienced the end of the war in these camps and were given the choice between staying in the US or returning to Japan. Tsurugi Akikusa chose to be repatriated and returned to his hometown of Yabegawa. By sheer coincidence, on the day he arrived, the town was holding a memorial for those who had perished in the war. Akikusa spotted his own photograph alongside those of the dead, and later wrote, "I attended my own funeral service." On the 6th of January 1949, a US Air Force supply sergeant discovered 2 men in dirty uniforms staring up at the American flag in front of the headquarters on Iwo Jima. The base had remained under occupation since 1945 and was now home to US Air Force squadrons. Puzzled, the supply sergeant took them to the base commander, where the mystery was solved. They were Yamakage Kafuku and Matsudo Linsoki, 2 machine gunners who had been part of the Japanese garrison and presumed dead by their families. They took the Americans to their cave, which had gone undiscovered for nearly 4 years. There, some of the Air Force personnel recognised items they thought had been stolen by their co-workers or civilian contractors, but had in fact been snatched by the 2 men. 1,382 days after the Battle of Iwo Jima officially ended, Kafuku and Linsoki had finally decided to surrender, making them the last holdouts to be found alive. Of the original 22,000 men who defended the island in February of 1945, only 1,083 lived to see their homeland again.